21, at the beginning of the chapter, we finally see Isaac being born. And this has been going on for several chapters here and a whole number of years, 14 years from the time that God first came to Abraham, even before Ishmael was born, and promised that there would be a child born. And, it goes all the way back to Sarah and Abraham taking it into their own hands, and Hagar going into Abraham and having a child by Ishmael. So it goes way back. And we come to chapter 21, and finally, Isaac, the promised child, is born. And it's kind of interesting as we look at this, we see that God has done it. So in verse 1, it says, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said. And then in verse 2, it says, Sarah conceived and bore Abraham in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And then in verse 4, it says that Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. So there's an emphasis in these first few verses, these initial verses, about God being responsible for this and it coming to pass. And then, of course, we see Sarah laughing again. So it says in verse 6, Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, for I have borne him a son in his old age? Now, initially, Sarah laughs in disbelief. That was her first laughter. And then Sarah tried to bring about the promise in her own way. That's Hagar. But now she is laughing again, but this time in triumph and in victory. God has made me laugh, and those who hear it will laugh with me. And as you may or may not know, the name Isaac means laughter. And so, there's just this undercurrent of the meaning of his name throughout, from beginning to end, until his birth. One thing that I think that stands out here in this passage is something to remember. It doesn't say it explicitly, but when we're trusting God and his promises, God doesn't always do his promises right away. So a whole bunch of years pass from the beginning, from the first mention of this, until it actually comes to pass. As a matter of fact, in the book of Hebrews, it says that some of them never saw the promises, waiting for the heavenly reward that was before them. And so we have to take a larger perspective a lot of times as to what is going on in our lives. Of course, what happens in our lives is really important to us, but when God looks at our lives, though he sees us, he also has a grand plan that is way beyond us, and sometimes we have to look at it from that perspective. This is going to be really important, I think, as we can move to the next section, where there's this issue between Hagar and Ishmael, and Sarah and Isaac and Abraham. And there's something in here that I find surprising, but I think we have to back off from what's actually happening here in particular and look at it from the perspective of what God is doing in the world. And so there is this casting out of the bondwoman for the sake of the true seed. And the bondwoman in this sense, I think, represents the world and the attempt through worldly efforts to bring about something that God had said he would do. In other words, he said that he would give a child of the promise, and Abraham and Sarah, through their means, they seek to bring it about, but it was not the way that God had intended to bring it about. So you have this seed of the world, if you will, as opposed to the seed of the promise, which God brings about through miraculous means. So cast out to the bondwoman, verse 10, it says, Sarah to Abraham, cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. So she is rejoicing in her son, obviously, and this is during the time of the weaning, so maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years after he is born. And so, like I said, a number of years is passing. Cast out the bondwoman and her son. She has no part with my son. And so she shows contempt for Hagar and for her son, which is not the first time. This has already happened once before, where Sarah says, cast him out, and Sarah it says that Abraham listened to her voice and cast her out. But then God comes to her and says, go back and act like you're supposed to act. This time, she's saying, Sarah is, cast out the bondwoman and her son. And Abraham is sorry about this. It says in verse 11, the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. In other words, there's an attachment, as you can imagine, that Abraham has with the son, even though he is the son of Hagar, and even though he is the son through this illegitimate relationship, if you will, and he still cares for him. So he is displeased, or he is upset about this, or distressed by it. But then here's the surprising part in verses 12 and 13. God says to Abraham, don't let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatsoever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. So this is kind of surprising. God is basically affirming Sarah's position of casting out the bondwoman. It has to do with the inheritance of, through the seed. And she is right, as God affirms it. She is right to cast out the bondwoman. And like I said, this is a little surprising, but we have to look at the bigger picture, because the seed is going to be an extremely important thing with respect to the coming of the Messiah, because this is the promised seed that would eventually lead to Christ coming and to the work of Christ on this earth and the death of the cross. In Galatians chapter 4, verses 28 through 31, it says, now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. So that's Galatians. And notice how it starts out here, that there was a persecution that took place between Ishmael and Isaac. And you might see it as, well, these are kids playing. Ishmael, I don't know, he's a teenager now, probably, and, persecuting this little kid. But what takes place in the context of when they're younger might escalate in the future, especially when you're considering the inheritance of Abraham. And so if Ishmael sticks around, there are all kinds of possibilities. Maybe Abraham's heart continues to be soft towards Ishmael, and he gives to him an inheritance that does not belong to him. We have seen already that Abraham doesn't always act with integrity, or doesn't always act, along the lines that God would have him act completely. And so, maybe there's that potential. There's also the potential that Ishmael rises up and does something to Isaac. Of course, I don't believe that God would have allowed that, but, here is Sarah and Abraham, and they're trying to figure it all out, and, they don't know what's going to happen, and they've already, gone through lying to protect themselves. Who knows what else is going to happen, or what else they might do in order to, protect themselves or whatever. You just don't know what kind of compromises are in the future. And God looks at it, though, and he sees this and kind of, steps in and says, yes, there must be a separation here. There must be a distinction between the son of the promise and the son of the world, the son of the flesh. And so send him out, cast him out. And that becomes a picture of the believer. We accept the promised Christ into our lives, and there must be a casting out or a renouncing of the world. We cannot have it both ways. Otherwise, it ends up being a compromise in our lives. If we seek to keep both of them in, there is going to be trouble and compromise in our lives. We've seen it with Lot. Remember, Lot was riding the fence, fell on the right side. Lot's wife was riding the fence and fell on the wrong side. And, that's the danger of compromise. Lot ended up on the right side, but he ended up with nothing, even though he was wealthy. And, of course, Lot's wife ended up with nothing also. But anyway, the compromise must not be allowed to take place. As Christians, we are the seed of the promise. We are children of the promise. And therefore, we must reject and cast out the world. And you hear it, and it's cliched, I'm sure, in Christian circles, but we are in the world, but not of the world. And as much as we've heard that, there is some significant truth to that. So here we are as Christians, the promise of God, we must renounce and reject the world in order to serve Christ, even though we remain here. So God also says, however, that he is going to make a great nation of Ishmael in verse 13. And he says it because he is, in fact, Abraham's seed. And God had promised to bless Abraham and his seed. So while Ishmael is going to be made a great nation by God, and we see God's protective hand over Hagar and Ishmael in this story here, and while he's going to be made a great nation, it is not going to be through the promise or through the blessing. It will be primarily or strictly, if you will, through natural worldly means, by the providence and the grace of God, but not more than that. In Romans chapter 9, 7 and 8, I actually went to these verses last time, but we'll look at them again real quick. It says, nor are they all children because they are the seed of Abraham, but in Isaac your seed shall be called. That is, those who are the children of the flesh. These are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as the seed. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say, and to seeds, as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ. That's Galatians chapter 3, verse 16. So we see in Galatians chapter 3, verse 16, that the actual promise to Abraham and his seed is actually a promise of Christ, a direct promise of Christ. The use of the singular seed there, Paul makes in Galatians chapter 3, verse 16. So that's the casting out of the bondwoman. And then the last section in this chapter is another encounter with Abimelech. And this is over a well of water, and it's just kind of reminiscent of what happened with Abraham and Lot. The servants are involved here. And Abimelech says, I do not know who has done this thing. And so Abimelech is once again ignorant, which we've already seen him being ignorant before. I don't know if there's any significance to that. What he says is legitimate here. He didn't know this either, and his servants had done this. But here you have a grievance between Abraham and Abimelech, and even though they have a conflict or a grievance against one another, they come together, and as grown, mature men, they resolve it through this compromise. I wonder here, it's just kind of funny. He says in verse 22, he says to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Verse 23, now therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me. Now I wonder why he asked him that question. Because he had dealt falsely with him before. And so, here he is going to make sure. Now Abraham, don't you deal falsely with me again. I've had enough of this. The last time you did that, it went really badly for me. So he starts out with, in their exchange, don't do that again. And then he rebukes him because apparently this is Abraham. Abraham is the one who has been grieved here. His well has been taken by the servants of Abimelech. So they confront one another with their complaints, and they speak to each other, and they listen to each other, and they come up with a formal agreement. And so through their respect for one another, and their compromise through this situation here, they're able to resolve the issue. And if you notice, here's our map from last time. In Gerar, which is where the incident from last chapter took place, they're now in Beersheba, which is a little bit south and to the east of Gerar. And that's where all of this is taking place. So Abimelech goes back to the land of the Philistines. Beersheba is technically, it becomes part of Israel, but they're still considering it part of the Philistine territory in this time, even though Abraham takes it on as his. In verse 33, it says, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. So that's what's taking place there in the end of this chapter. And the significant thing here, obviously, is the birth of Isaac and then the casting out of Ishmael. That's the important part in this chapter. And we see God fulfilling his promises, even though sometimes it takes a long time. And then we see the need for the separation between the promise and the life of the Christian and what's going on in the world around us. Any questions or comments, Philip?
How does this agreement between Abraham and Abimelech, does it carry forward at all when the Israelites come to conquer the land?
Well, that's an interesting question. The Philistines are not going to occupy Beersheba again. It's going to remain as part of the land of Israel. So they're going to conquer it, and the Philistines are going to remain along the coast there in their 5 cities or whatever, and Beersheba is not counted among them. So whether that's just providential, that through the conquest they conquer the land of Beersheba and take it away from the Canaanites, but not the rest of the Philistine territory completely, or for a time, or whatever. I'm not sure. I would have to look to see if there's some connection more direct than just God's providential, working things out.
Well,
unless you're aware of something that.
And Abimelech wasn't technically from Beersheba per se.
No, but it seems like Beersheba is considered part of the Philistine territory at this time. We saw last time that the Philistines are first in the idea. The name Philistine is introduced first in the last chapter, and it carries over to here, and they're in Beersheba, and it seems like Beersheba is part of the Philistine territory. Now, of course, Israel. There is no Israel. There's only Abraham. And we saw how he moved all the way down between Shur and Kadesh Barnea, but then, he comes up to dwell into the Philistine territory. So we don't know, or I don't know anyways, how much of this area is considered Philistine territory. It might be the whole piece of land from the ridge, which Beersheba's kind of, on that ridge, all the way to the coast. That whole area might be Philistine territory under Abimelech's control. It doesn't really say, but it seems that Beersheba at this point is under Philistine territory, and Abraham kind of takes it legitimately through this covenant that he makes with Abimelech. And that reminds me of another covenant that he had. Well, it's not a covenant, but he actually purchased up by Mamre. He actually purchased, was it Abraham? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Maybe it was Jacob who purchased to bury Sarah, his wife.
That would be Abraham.
Yeah. What?
That would be Abraham.
Rachel, his wife.
No, it was...
Was it Abraham that purchased from... I'm not remembering that. Is it... Was it Abraham? Abraham, the oaks of Mamre, he purchases a plot there in order to bury... Oh, that hasn't happened yet. Sarah's not dead yet. Oh, all right, so... That's why I'm so confused, because it hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen. So he obtains Beersheba with this covenant with Abimelech, and we're going to see him back in Mamre around the time of Sarah's death, and he's going to purchase the land there in order to have a burial place for them. So here are 2 places at least that come legitimately, in worldly terms, to Abraham. And of course, when the conquest takes place, the whole land is going to be given to them by God. But we have these 2 places here. And another incident comes to mind, and this is David when he, the threshing floor of Arona, when the angel comes down and he sees the angel there, and he wants that spot, which is going to be the place where the temple is built, which is actually the place where Abraham offered up Isaac. We haven't gotten to that either. And the guy who owns the mountain there, where the angel was, offers to give it to David, but David refuses and says, no, I'm going to purchase it. But that's after the conquest, so there's still all these negotiations that are going on there. But I really don't know the answer to your question without looking up Beersheba a little bit more and seeing.
Well, I mean, it kind of seems similar to when Joshua makes the agreement with the city that he shouldn't have made the agreement with.
Oh, yeah, the Gibeonites, the
Mhm.
Gibeonites.
I mean, it kind of seems like it would be a similar.
Oh, like this is he should not have done this agreement with Abimelech.
Well,
Is that
I'm
what you're
not
saying?
necessarily saying that, but it
Yeah.
seems like it would kind of, it wasn't just, oh, between me and you, it was a kind of a perpetual
Agreement.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I just know Beersheba is going to be a significant city in the life of Israel, especially around the time of David. And it never goes back to anybody else, especially the Philistines. They're not going to occupy it back. And so maybe they're aware of the agreement, and as it passes down, they're willing to honor it. We see David having some legitimate exchanges with the Philistines. They're not always fighting, but most of the time they're fighting. It seems that I haven't come across anything that would suggest that this was a wrongful agreement that he's making at this point. So maybe he's finally doing it right, especially since Abimelech starts the whole thing. Don't deal falsely with me now, maybe that's... All right, so we're going to do this the right way. And this time, Abraham gives some gifts to Abimelech, although not near what he received from him. Plus, he gets the watering pole. All right, any other questions or comments on this? Or anything on the chapter? All right, good. Prayer requests.